In the heart of Zuberi, a lively village where the air buzzed with the sounds of merchants bargaining and children laughing, Adebayo and Ayana were the couple everyone envied. They weren't just wealthy, they were admired, respected, and seen as the perfect match. Adebayo, a man of sharp intellect and ambition, had built his fortune through years of hard work. He was known for his ability to turn simple deals into massive profits, and traders from distant lands sought his expertise. His name carried power, and his wealth was a symbol of his success. Ayana, his wife, was the heart of their home. She wasn't just beautiful, she had a presence that commanded attention. Her kindness made her beloved by the villagers, and her grace made her unforgettable. Wherever she went, people stopped to greet her. Children ran to her for sweets, and women admired her warmth. She was the perfect wife for a man like Adebayo, elegant, supportive, and endlessly devoted. Their home was a grand structure, towering over the rest of the village. It was built with the finest wood, decorated with gold trimming, and filled with the most exquisite fabrics and treasures from Adebayo's travel. Servants catered to their every need, ensuring that their life was one of comfort and ease. Every evening, their house was alive with laughter as guests enjoyed the lavish feasts they hosted. The couple moved through life effortlessly, basking in love, wealth, and admiration. Adebayo took pride in his wife, showing her off at every festival and village gathering. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of happiness. People whispered about their love, the way they looked at each other, the way Adebayo's eyes sparkled when he spoke about his wife. It seemed like nothing could ever break the life they had built together. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks, and even the strongest foundations can crumble when tested. It started as a small thing, something Ayana barely noticed. One morning, as she stood by the window, watching the sunrise over the village, a strange weakness washed over her. Her hands trembled slightly, and her legs felt unusually heavy. She shook it off, telling herself it was just exhaustion. The nights had been long, filled with endless feasts, celebrations, and responsibilities. She was probably just tired. Nothing a little rest couldn't fix. But the weakness didn't go away. Instead, it grew worse. Days turned into weeks, and Ayana found herself struggling to get out of bed. Her body felt like it was betraying her. Simple tasks became exhausting, and even speaking for too long left her breathless. The once vibrant and graceful woman began to wither before everyone's eyes. The servants whispered, concerned but unsure how to help. The villagers noticed too, but no one dared to question what was happening behind the doors of Adebayo's grand home. Adebayo, at first, showed concern. He called for the best foods, bringing her fruits and special dishes to restore her strength. He stayed by her side in the evenings, holding her hand, assuring her that she would be fine. But deep inside, a shadow of frustration began to grow. This wasn't the life he had signed up for. His wife was supposed to be strong, radiant, the jewel of their home. Instead, she was becoming a shadow of herself, confined to bed, unable to keep up with their once perfect life. Desperate for answers, Adebayo called for Mama Sefu, the village healer. She was known for her wisdom, a woman who had healed countless people with her herbs and knowledge. When she arrived, she sat beside Ayana, studying her carefully. The room was silent, tension thick in the air as Mama Sefu placed her wrinkled hands on Ayana's forehead. A deep sigh escaped her lips before she finally spoke. "She is sick," Mama Sefu said, her voice heavy with certainty. "A rare illness, one that does not pass quickly." Adebayo's chest tightened. "How long will it take?" he asked, his voice sharp, impatient. Mama Sefu glanced at Ayana, then back at him. "She will need time, care, and patience to recover." Her words were slow, deliberate, as if she already knew they would not be welcomed. This is not an illness that fades overnight. Ayana, despite her weakness, noticed the shift in Adebayo's expression, the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes darkened. He didn't ask what she needed. He didn't ask how to help. He only cared about how long it would take. And in that moment, she realized something chilling. Her illness wasn't just a test for her body, it was a test for her marriage. At first, Adebayo tried to be the caring husband everyone expected him to be. He brought Ayana the finest foods, ensuring she had the best fruits, the richest broths, and the softest blankets. He sat by her side, whispering reassurances, running his fingers through her hair. But deep inside, something in him was growing restless. Ayana, once the radiant woman who filled their home with warmth and laughter, was now a ghost of herself. She barely spoke, barely moved. The spark in her eyes had dimmed. The woman who once managed the house effortlessly, who made their home a place of comfort, was now lying in bed, fragile and helpless. Adebayo didn't like it. He didn't like coming home to silence, to an empty table, to a wife who could no longer be the woman he married. He tried, at first, but patience had never been his strongest trait. His visits to her bedside became shorter, his words fewer. The food he once brought with care was now placed on the table with indifference. He would sit for a moment, sighing loudly, waiting for something, anything to change, but nothing did. Every day was the same. The house, once lively, felt suffocating. The grand walls that had echoed with laughter now felt like a prison. Servants moved around quietly, avoiding his gaze, knowing better than to speak when his frustration was this obvious. He hated it. He hated watching his wife waste away. He hated the pitying looks from the villagers when they asked about her. But most of all, he hated the feeling creeping into his chest, the realization that this wasn't the life he wanted. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, drowning in resentment. He had built a life of luxury, of power. He had worked too hard to be trapped in a home that now felt like a graveyard. He wanted laughter. He wanted vibrance. He wanted the woman he had married, not the weak, helpless version of her that now lay in their bed. And with each passing day, the frustration inside him grew, eating away at whatever love remained. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing against the walls of the once lively home. Adebayo sat at the edge of the bed, staring at Ayana. She was asleep, her breathing shallow, her body still. She looked so different from the woman he had married, the woman who once filled his life with warmth. Now she was a shell of herself, fragile, helpless, and he couldn't take it anymore. Something inside him snapped. He had spent months watching her fade, pretending to care, pretending to be the devoted husband. But he wasn't. He never had the patience for weakness. And now, that weakness was consuming everything. His home, his happiness, his life. This wasn't the future he had envisioned. He hadn't worked so hard to end up with a wife who couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet. His decision came easily, almost too easily. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't hesitate as he reached for a bag, stuffing it with his finest clothes, his gold, the things that mattered. There was no guilt, no second thoughts. He had convinced himself this was the only way. He deserved more. He deserved a woman, not a burden. He turned to look at her one last time. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows across her face. She looked peaceful, unaware that the man she trusted was about to leave her to fight alone. For a brief moment, something inside him stirred, an old memory of love, of the vows they had made, but he crushed it before it could grow. Love wasn't enough. Love wouldn't bring back the woman he wanted. Leaning down, he whispered, "I need a woman, not a burden." His voice was cold, final. And then, without looking back, he walked out. The door closed softly behind him, swallowed by the darkness. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He was free, free from the weight of a sick wife, free from the suffocating silence. He didn't care where he was going, only that he was leaving. Back in the room, Ayana stirred, her fingers twitching as if reaching for something, someone, but there was nothing. Only an empty bed, an empty house, and the cruel reality that she had been left to fight for her life alone. Ayana's eyes fluttered open, the dim morning light casting long shadows across the room. Her throat was dry, her body weak, but she forced out a whisper. "Adebayo?" The name barely left her lips, but there was no answer. She tried again, this time a little louder. Silence. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt eerily empty. She turned her head slowly, pain shooting through her limbs. Her heart pounded as she glanced at the untouched food on the table, the empty chair beside her bed. Something was wrong. Adebayo always sat there, even if his visits had grown cold and distant. But now the space was vacant, the air heavy with absence. She tried to move, but her body refused. Days of weakness had stolen her strength. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, gripping the edge of the blanket. With every ounce of effort, she pushed herself up, but the room spun, and she collapsed back onto the bed. Hunger clawed at her stomach. Her lips cracked from dehydration. The realization crept in like a slow poison. Adebayo was gone. He had left her, alone. Panic surged through her veins. She listened, hoping for footsteps, for the sound of the door creaking open. But the only thing that greeted her was silence, thick and suffocating. She turned her gaze toward the window, the village outside moving as if nothing had changed. Life continued beyond these walls, but for her, time had stopped. The villagers knew. They had to. Whispers carried through the streets, hushed voices speaking of the once great Adebayo who had abandoned his sick wife. Some pitied her, others simply shook their heads. But no one knocked on her door. No one came to offer food or comfort. She was a burden, just as Adebayo had believed, and now she was paying the price. The days blurred together. Hunger gnawed at her insides, but she had no strength to crawl to the kitchen. Her throat burned, her lips bled from dryness, but there was no water within reach. The walls around her felt like a cage, trapping her in her suffering. At night, the darkness felt heavier, pressing against her chest, filling her with fear. The silence wasn't just outside, it was inside her, creeping into her soul, whispering cruel truths. No one was coming. She was going to die here, alone, forgotten. Days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Ayana could barely keep her eyes open, her body too weak to fight the hunger, the thirst, the unbearable loneliness. The walls of her once grand home now felt like a tomb, trapping her in her suffering. She had accepted it. This was how she would die, alone, forgotten. But fate had other plans. Kwame was just passing through, his feet dusty from travel, his eyes scanning the village for supplies before continuing his journey. He wasn't from here, but he had seen enough in life to recognize when something was wrong. As he walked past Ayana's house, a strange stillness made him pause. The home, once lively, stood eerily quiet. The air around it felt heavy, filled with something invisible, yet undeniable. Curiosity pulled him closer. He knocked once. No answer. Again, louder this time. Silence. He hesitated before pushing the door open, his breath catching at the sight before him. A woman lay motionless, her frame so thin it seemed as though the life had been drained from her. Her once beautiful face was pale, her lips cracked, her eyes sunken. She was breathing, but barely. His heart clenched. How could someone be left in such a state? Who had allowed this? Rushing to her side, he knelt down, gently placing a hand on her forehead, burning, feverish. He reached for the water flask at his waist, carefully tilting it to her lips. At the first touch of water, her eyes fluttered open, but she didn't move. She couldn't. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and concern. But Ayana only blinked, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't need to answer. The silence said it all. Kwame clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He could leave. This wasn't his problem. But something inside him wouldn't allow it. He had seen too much suffering in his travels, too much cruelty disguised as indifference. He wouldn't be part of it. Without another word, he scooped her frail body into his arms, holding her as if she weighed nothing. She was light, too light. It made his stomach twist. How long had she been like this? How long had she waited for someone to care? The villagers watched as he carried her through the streets, their whispers following him. Some shook their heads, others turned away, unwilling to meet his eyes. They had seen her suffering, yet none of them had done anything. The shame of it made him walk faster. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the village, where the hills stretched toward the sky. His home wasn't far now, nestled between the trees, hidden from the world. There, she would be safe. There, she would heal. As he walked, Ayana's head rested against his chest, her breath shallow but steady. She didn't know where he was taking her. She didn't even know if she would survive, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. Kwame's home was nothing like the grand house Ayana once lived in, but it was safe, warm, and filled with kindness, something she had not felt in a long time. At first, she was too weak to move, too exhausted to speak. Kwame did not press her for answers. He simply cared for her, bringing her nourishing meals, keeping her comfortable, and ensuring she had the rest her body desperately needed. His patience never wavered, unlike the man who had once promised to love her forever. Days turned into weeks, and Ayana's body slowly responded to the care she received. She could sit up without feeling dizzy, take a few steps without collapsing, and even smile at the birds that perched near the window. But her body was only part of the battle. Her mind was still trapped in the past, haunted by the betrayal, the loneliness, and the realization that the man she had given everything to had abandoned her without a second thought. Kwame saw the pain in her eyes and decided to do more than just help her heal. He wanted her to become stronger than she had ever been. He took her to the lush forests surrounding his home, introducing her to the power of nature. He taught her which herbs could cure sickness, which roots could give energy, and which flowers could ease pain. Ayana soaked up the knowledge, her curiosity awakening something inside her that had been buried beneath years of being a devoted wife. For the first time, she was learning how to survive on her own, without depending on anyone. As the months passed, Ayana transformed. She was no longer the fragile woman who had been left to die. She was stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Her hands, once delicate and soft, became skilled at preparing remedies. Her once timid steps now carried confidence. But most of all, her heart, which had been shattered, was no longer filled with sorrow. It was filled with determination. She had been abandoned, but she had not been defeated. And soon, the world would see the woman she had become. Adebayo had left behind a sick wife without hesitation, convinced that life had more to offer him than the burden of caring for someone who could no longer serve him. He wanted excitement, pleasure, and freedom, and for a while, he found it. With his wealth and charm, he moved from town to town, surrounding himself with women who adored his money, drinking the finest wine and indulging in every luxury he could get his hands on. He felt untouchable, unstoppable. But wealth is like sand slipping through fingers. It never lasts when handled carelessly. Adebayo, blinded by his arrogance, trusted the wrong people. His business partners, who once flattered him, began to see his recklessness as a weakness. They whispered behind his back, plotted in secret, and when the time was right, they took everything from him. One by one, his investments crumbled, his gold vanished, his once thriving business collapsed. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. He had been played like a fool. Still, he clung to his pride. He told himself he could rebuild, that his charm and intelligence would bring him back to the top. But without money, the world no longer saw him as important. The women who had once laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word now turned their backs on him. The friends who had cheered him on at lavish feasts disappeared overnight. He was no longer Adebayo, the wealthy trader. He was just another man struggling to survive. Desperation led him to dark places. He borrowed money from dangerous people, thinking he could make a quick profit and rise again. But when he couldn't pay them back, they took their payment in another way, through pain. Beaten and humiliated, he was left on the streets. A man who once lived like a king, now reduced to a beggar. Hunger gnawed at him. His once strong body, built on rich meals and comfort, became thin and frail. His clothes, once the finest in the village, turned to rags. He wandered from town to town, looking for work, but no one wanted to hire a man with nothing to offer. Then, sickness struck. It started with a fever, then weakness, then unbearable pain. His body, once full of strength, now betrayed him, just as he had betrayed Ayana. He coughed through the nights, shivering in the cold, his stomach empty, his soul even emptier. And as he lay on the hard ground, too weak to move, too broken to fight, a thought crept into his mind, a thought he had avoided for so long. He had abandoned the one person who truly loved him, and now life had abandoned him in return. Adebayo dragged his tired body through the streets of a nearby town, his vision blurred from hunger and sickness. His once proud shoulders were hunched, his steps unsteady. Every door he knocked on slammed shut. Every plea for help was met with cold indifference. The world he once dominated had no place for a man like him anymore. He was just another forgotten soul, discarded by fate, his stomach twisted in pain, his head burned with fever, and his legs finally gave out beneath him. He fell to the ground, too weak to rise. His breath came in ragged gasps. The world around him spun, voices murmuring in the distance. Then, footsteps approached. A soft yet commanding voice spoke above him. "Bring him inside," the voice said. Hands lifted him, carrying him into a place filled with warmth. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, and his gaze met the face of the woman he had left behind. His breath caught in his throat. Ayana. But she was not the same woman he had abandoned. The fragile, helpless wife who once relied on him was gone. In her place stood someone unrecognizable. Her once thin frame was now strong. Her posture radiated confidence. She wore fine robes, but not the kind of wealth that screamed excess. No, hers was the kind earned through wisdom and respect. People around her looked at her with admiration, listening when she spoke, moving when she commanded. Adebayo tried to speak, but his throat was dry. His lips trembled. His heart pounded. How could this be? How was she standing above him when he had left her to die? Ayana stared at him, her expression unreadable. There was no hatred in her eyes, no burning rage. That would have been easier for him to face, but the calmness, the strength, made him feel even smaller. "You should rest," she finally said before turning away. Adebayo watched as she walked past him, her presence filling the room like a force of nature. He wanted to beg, to explain, to cry out for forgiveness, but for the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. He was no longer in control, and Ayana was no longer the woman he had left behind. Adebayo lay on the ground, his body frail, his hands shaking as he reached out toward Ayana. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with desperation. "I was a fool," he murmured, his eyes brimming with tears. "I see it now. I see everything." Ayana knelt beside him, her expression calm, unreadable. She did not look at him with hatred or anger. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, there was only quiet understanding, a kind of distant sorrow that cut deeper than rage ever could. "You left me when I was weak," she said softly, "and now life has done the same to you." Adebayo shuddered. Those words struck him like a blade to the chest. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, casting her aside like she was nothing. And now, here he was, cast aside, forgotten, just as he had once done to her. She called for her helpers. "Take him inside," she ordered. "Give him food, let him rest." Adebayo's heart swelled with hope, but the moment he looked into her eyes, he knew the truth. She was helping him, yes, but not out of love, not out of longing. She had moved on. The realization crushed him. He had lost not just his wealth, not just his strength, but the only person who had ever truly loved him, and no amount of regret could ever bring her back. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with more powerful stories. Check out the videos on the end screen for more content that will keep you hooked. Thanks for being part of this journey.